Our next speaker is Rachel Harris, PhD. Rachel is a psychologist with both clinical and research experience. She received an NIH New Investigator Award earlier in her career as a research scientist in the Miami VA Hospital and the Psychiatry Department at the University of Miami School of Medicine. Dr. Harris has published over 40 scientific articles in professional journals. Her clinical experience began as an Esalen residential fellow, and she has been in private practice as a psychotherapist for over 35 years. Rachel is the author of 20-minute retreats, revive your spirit in just minutes a day with simple self-led practices, and co-author of Teenagers Learn What They Live, and the best-selling Children Learn What They Live. And I want to point out that Rachel gathered data here 3 years ago, I think, and 2 years ago, 4 or 5 years ago. So the data has been, as you might imagine, a long time in coming, but she's used the Horizons audience as respondents, and so in a way this is coming full circle, and now she's going to report on these results.
Yes, I absolutely want to thank the Horizons community. It was maybe 4 and 5 years ago. I stood in the back and waved my questionnaires and asked people to fill them out and to connect me to other people, and lo and behold, people helped. And so my research is on what's happening with ayahuasca in North America. So that was the criteria to be in the study, that someone had experienced ayahuasca in North America. If they only had experienced it in Latin America, they weren't in my study. So this is sort of the underground in the United States and Canada. So, and I also want to thank, I owe a thanks to MAPS. They helped with some of the channeling of the private funding that I received for the research. And I want to thank my co-author, Lee Gorell, who's not here today, but he was one of my mentors in my research career. And during the 3 years or so of this project, he turned 86. And he received an award from the American Psychological Association for a lifetime achievement. And he never once questioned anything about this research. He was just incredibly open, and we worked very well together, as we always had. And basically, we both came out of retirement to do this project. So I think those are all my thank yous. Oh no, I have to thank Nella Wisniewski for doing the visuals. You'll see how beautiful, they're as beautiful as Nella. So, okay. Here's this wonderful part. It's a little snippet of a poem by W.S. Merwin. He went into the dream farther, and it came with him into the day, and from then on was all around him. So for those of you who were here yesterday and hearing some of the federally supported research, and today hearing about the research that's being done with ayahuasca, it's got a different flavor, so to speak. And so this quality of the ayahuasca experience coming into the day and all around us, this is some of what will come up through the research. You'll hear it. This is a wonderful poetic reference to it. I defined my study to focus on what happens after the ceremony. There's a landmark study by an Israeli psychologist, Shannon, which I've been pronouncing, giving it the Irish pronunciation Shannon, but it's, I think, Shannon, Israeli. And he looked at what were the visions, and he wrote like a 400-page book about it. And it was a content analysis of the visions. I didn't ask about visions at all. I asked about what happened afterwards. And how did you integrate your experience into your daily life? How did it change your life? How did it change you? What meaning did it have for you? What difference does it make in your life? I wanted the clinical questions of how did it shape your life and the direction of your life? And I also put on the very front page of the research protocol that I was being guided by grandmother ayahuasca to do this research. So I was asking people about their use of an illegal substance, and because I'm at this stage in my life not in the academic world, I felt free enough to be able to say, me too. I'm here because of Grandmother Ayahuasca. I'm asking these questions almost on behalf of her. I'm doing this project. And so, oh my goodness. And I have to tell you, that is the response. You know, I have the questionnaire with me. It was a 16-page questionnaire with 8 pages of essay questions. This is ridiculous. And people were happy to write answers and share their experiences, and they would write through the 8 pages, and then they would write me like a 2-page letter. It was really quite remarkable. So here's an alternative that I found, and this is from a Navajo healing ceremony, and I don't know if that means peyote or not, but this is a different cultural context for what happens after a ceremony. For 4 days after the conclusion of the ceremony, the patient is considered by family and friends as if he or she is a holy person and given an opportunity to focus, evaluate, interpret, and experience a new self. I mean, just sort of soak that in. What a wonderful opportunity that would be. We, on the other hand, get up the next day and go to work. And we can't talk about it at work, needless to say, most of us. And so to have that experience of being seen by your community as a new self, as part of the integration process, is wonderful. Here's a contrasting quote, and it was to the question something about what did you learn from your experience. And here's the quote from one of the participants in my study, a very honest, self-revealing, vulnerable quote. "The learnings faded because I didn't have a network to discuss it." And so that's the contrast. So I found 81 people who had used ayahuasca in North America at least once. And those 81 people represented 2,267 ceremonies, which was a higher number than Benny Shannon's work represented. He was over 2,000 also. So this is a substantial amount of experience that people were writing from and describing and talking about and what happened to them. So it was that you'd used it at least once, but some people had used it many, many times. So, you know, here's the description of the, I found a comparison group. And I have to say the whole process of doing this, I've run NIH research projects. This one, everything just sort of was aligned and fell into place. And so a comparison group landed in my lap, essentially. And they were people who attended a very traditional Catholic retreat center in Connecticut, no less. And, you know, they would do meditation, well, they would say prayer. They would have prayer sessions and discussion sessions, and this is a description in a general way of what the retreat was like. But these were a group of spiritually minded people who would be having a concentrated experience of a spiritual nature. It's not a controlled study. This was the comparison group. And I asked both groups to answer just some basic demographic information. The ayahuasca group answered the 8 pages of essay questions, but both groups filled out a questionnaire after the spiritual experience. And I'll talk a little bit more about that questionnaire. But the demographic data included just questions about, do you have a regular spiritual practice, something you do? I think I asked 5 or 6 days a week, not just 1 or 2 days, a commitment to a spiritual practice. And have you had any psychotherapy? Because I've been in private practice all these years. I want to know, how does psychotherapy fit with your spiritual life and the unfolding? And what's your affiliation? And most of the people on retreat were Catholics. No surprise. And then I asked all these open-ended questions about, to the ayahuasca users about the ceremony itself, and the set and setting, and the intentions, and how you were prepared, what information you had, and any details. and what happened afterwards. So I really asked a lot about the ceremony itself. And then I asked, how are you changed? How are you different in this whole long list of ways? And this is, you know, if you think about answering with a little essay question about each of these items, it's really quite a lot. And I should say that the questionnaire was developed with the help of very experienced Western shaman. So they had, of course, their own years of experience, and they were also initiated and trained as shaman, but they were Westerners. This was my own limitation, and also it's a cultural difference. So these were Western psychological questions, and so I was limited to English, so I asked Western shaman. The scale, you know, there's a sort of a tradition in this psychedelic literature, and it began, Pankey developed a scale that he used on the Good Friday experiment. Some of you may know about it. This was in the 60s when people were given, it was a controlled study of seminary students, and he identified these aspects that are associated with mystical experience. And then when Griffiths developed his scale to use in the psilocybin study, he based it on Pankey's work, and then I took the questionnaire that he was using and I adapted it for my group. So there's sort of a flow of information here that we've each changed the scale that we've used, but there's a history to the sources of it. And then what's so interesting about the Good Friday experiment was that Rick Doblin, is he here today? Is Rick here? He followed it up 25 years later and asked people about their psychedelic experience from 25 years ago. And one of the important findings is that the people still said, I think all but one said it was one of the top 5 experiences in my life. So I'll be mentioning things where, for those of you who were here yesterday, you can begin to hear themes that flow through the different research projects, even though the drug or medicine is different. So I think yesterday was a lot about psilocybin and MDMA, but there are themes that this was one of the top experiences in my life, that you hear this in from other research. So the questionnaire I used, I had 81 questions, and we did a factor analysis, which means it's a correlation matrix, and it's sort of a statistical way of finding which items in the questionnaire fall together. And so the factor 1 has the highest, they're highly correlated, the highest correlation of these items, and they fall together. And the question then for the researcher is, well, what's this factor measuring? What's the theme here? And you know, when I was first working with this data, and I really struggled with it, I called this factor 1, these items, I sort of called it spiritual attunement. But I was unhappy with that. I thought it sounded great, but I didn't really know what it meant myself. And then you'll see the second factor I actually named relationship to the sacred, and then I didn't know how to differentiate the two. How is spiritual attunement different from relationship to the sacred? And so I consulted with a friend of mine who's a religion professor. He had never seen a factor analysis study, but he's quite brilliant, and his specialty is mysticism. And so he looked at the items, and he just looked at me. He said, and it was this sort of exuberant, "This is joy in life." And it was like, oh my God, how did I miss this? And so and even, you know, the 4th item down, the joy in my life has increased. You know, you would think I would notice this. But I felt that joy is absolutely part of a mystical experience. And here it is, and this was the first factor, the highest correlated. The second factor is relationship to the sacred, and there you begin to see that there's what someone else was calling in one of the presentations yesterday an ontological shift, that there's that after a mystical experience as a result of one of the psychedelics, people sort of shift in an ontological way to a very different position in life. So this, I think, picks up that shift, that my relationship to the sacred has deepened, has intensified, has grown, has expanded, a lot of different ways of saying it. But I think it's a very important factor. And we, some of the discussion yesterday, we don't really know psychologically, how does a mystical experience result in someone not having cravings to smoke cigarettes, which the tobacco addiction is one of the most intense. How do we go from there to there, from a mystical experience to not even having a craving anymore after, I think it was 30 years of smoking a pack a day? We don't know. We don't quite know how this is working, but certainly you're hearing in the themes of the research that the mystical experience changes people's lives, and people know it. They come back 25 years later and say, yes, it was one of the 5 most important experiences of my life. There's another thing that this relationship to the sacred sort of intimates a little bit, and it certainly was throughout Yalila's presentation, that especially with ayahuasca and some of the plant medicines, there's a direct relationship, and I'll talk about that more. But that's very different than what we heard yesterday in the federally funded research using pills. It's very different to be using a plant. The third factor was easy to identify for a psychotherapist. It's, toxic feelings. I mean, it's easy for almost all of us to identify. And these are reverse scored, so that meant it was originally, well, that's a little complicated, but what it meant was that the lower score was better, like a golf score. It was less of the toxic feelings. And so here's the comparison between the ayahuasca users and the people on retreat. And I mean, this is sort of like almost like a knock-knock joke. How is someone who uses ayahuasca similar to someone who attends a Catholic retreat? It's a little hard. But amazingly, they were both mature. The people on retreat were older. This is the mean age. They were older. There were more men than women, but they were all very well educated, extraordinarily well educated. It's an unusual. It's not a random group. This is a highly educated group, both of them. And then now these were the questions about the ayahuasca ceremony, and almost all reported that the ceremony took place in a ritualistic, sacred way, that there was respect, there were prayers, opening and closing, there was talk about integration, there was time afterwards, usually a sharing circle. 2/3 of the leaders of the ceremony were involved in the sharing circles. But here's the interesting thing, only 10% were available after. And so when it comes to integration, that's an important question, because integration is a process that happens in the days following. And if you remember some of the clinical standards for care in the MAP study, especially where they're doing it by the book, so to speak, they have a manual. It's the focusing on integration, and it's in the hours afterward and the days afterward. And so I want to repeat that the people reported only 10% of the leaders of their group were available after. I also want to mention there were 5 people who said that they took ayahuasca on their own, which is not usually done. If it's done in an initiation kind of way, it's still done in the energy field of the initiating shaman. It's not done in a Western setting, like the Lone Ranger goes off alone into the sunset, which is our tendency in our culture to do it alone, and I really want to caution about that. Here's my most direct question: what did you do to integrate your experience? And people did, these are kind of the standard things that people do, and it makes perfect sense. And I love the change their lives based on insights. It's a no-brainer, but it's not so easy to do. Many of us have not done that. We might have the insight, but we don't change our lives. It doesn't necessarily flow. And also, I love the felt more gratitude. I think gratitude is a great healing emotion. And it's one that that's mentioned often in ayahuasca circles. Of course, as a therapist, I had to ask, so did you see a therapist? And I'm sure you've heard this kind of quote before. Most people said no, but people said it was 10 weeks of psychotherapy in one night. I've also heard 10 years of psychotherapy in one night. So there's a range there. And people said that a therapist who had not experienced ayahuasca would not understand. And I want to take a stand here and say, I agree. I'm sorry, but I think that's true. And I have often said to my clients in one way or another, this is not something you should ever say to a psychiatrist. You have to be very careful where you talk about these kinds of experiences, no matter what they are. But here's, the most intense quote. The very idea of seeing a therapist sounds peculiar at best, ridiculous at worst. But I do want to say that one person said that they went to a Jungian therapist and that the Jungian was helpful. So I figure this is, for the Jungians 1, for the rest of us 0. But, I'm sorry, the therapists are going to have to catch up. Oh, sorry. So here's what people came out of the ceremonies with. What messages or instructions did you receive? And this is just, these all sound good, but what's different after a ceremony is people have had an experience of loving themselves more, an experience of having their heart opened. So it's not just someone telling them, oh, you should love yourself. It's great advice. I mean, we wouldn't need therapists if that's all we had to do is say, love yourself more. But people came out, yes, this was the message and instruction I received, but I had this alive experience in my soul, in the cells of my body. I have this inside of me now. The question is, how long does that last? How do I then integrate it into life? But people were often, because it is grandmother ayahuasca, she gave very specific advice to some people, and my favorite is, clean your room. And then people reported life changes, feeling more calm. These are all the positive kinds of affect, but also being more present in the moment. There was one important exception to this, and the person said that he failed to integrate the insights gained during the ayahuasca ceremony into his ongoing behavior. And I felt that was very important. Again, a very vulnerable statement. Very important to admit that. To say, yes, grandmother ayahuasca told me to do X, Y, Z, and I didn't live up to it. I failed. And so I know I didn't take a step there. Now, I don't know, because this was a one-shot. It was research that looked at people at one point in time. There isn't a follow-up to say what happened afterwards. And these are some of the questions that we have about how does this work? I mean, if someone is having regular ceremonies, would that person at some point down the road say, yes, it was hard for me to change, but after X number of ceremonies, I was finally able to take the steps I needed to? We don't know. It's a question we have to ask. Here's the questions about addictions, and I did not ask about tobacco addiction, of course, which I'm now sorry about, but there was a report on smoking cessation yesterday. But people stopped drinking alcohol altogether, certainly less. Some people stopped using marijuana, some people increased their use, but they felt they were using it as an ally. And others reported less use of psychedelics. And this was a group, I asked them what other psychedelics they used, and the lists were long. And were a surprise to me. But they were long. These were sophisticated people. And one person put it this way, that he felt loyal to ayahuasca and that other drugs seemed superfluous. Again, there's this presence of a relationship that's there's a different quality to this experience. People reported improved abilities in healing and creativity, a lot of music. This I'm sure you know, but here it is. The experience improved their meditation. Physical health, psychologists have failed. I don't mean to dump on psychologists or therapists so much in this presentation, but we have failed miserably getting people to change their health behaviors. When it comes to food and exercise, we're not very good at it, hence there are TV shows about it. But people reported amazing changes in their health and diet and the way they took care of themselves, and that they felt better. One person and this just cuts to the bottom line here, that simply described eating less and feeling better. There it is. So, and someone else said less anxiety around eating, that I think was important. This is really important for you to take a minute to actually read, because this is one of the key things that we look for in therapy. If somebody's doing better, do they feel better about themselves? Is there an improvement in their quality of their relationships? Do they feel more connected? And here you can hear that there's a greater openness and ability to be involved in an authentic, honest relationship with awareness, even the letting go of toxic relationships and improving relationships with parents is critically important to integration. The mood was improved, less toxic, more peaceful. Insight. This is a quality of insight that you often read about when it comes to the use of mindfulness as a psychotherapeutic tool. And there's a sense of objectivity here, the ability to witness my own emotional experiences and moods and have a little distance from it. So there's a sense of I can be more accepting, I can handle it better, less likely to get swept up in my own dramas. There's a sense of a distance there that's very important therapeutically and came through very strongly. Dreams. The most wonderful thing is that one person reported that he felt that what he learned from the ceremony was continuing in his dreams. There's this sense of a flow back and forth from ceremony to the dream world to real life, and that's what integration looks like, where information goes across those states of consciousness, and we have access to that movement through. And so that what we do in our life is informed by other states of consciousness, dreams or ceremonies. Synchronicity improved, except for one person said, I no longer believe in synchronicity. I have no clue what happened there. The attitude towards self, this also improved and is one of the things we look for in psychotherapy. And toward life, greater faith. This reduced fear of death, I think, is important. There's a good bit of research about psychedelics being used to reduce anxiety for people who are terminally ill. It's what seems to emerge from the psychedelic experience, a mystical experience, is a different relationship, a different attitude toward death. It's a huge ontological shift, especially in our culture. Here we have the spiritual and religious beliefs changing, a renewed and deepened sense. Probably the most important change, I have regular contact with spirit guides. This is not talked about in the government studies. So the results I was getting were so overwhelmingly positive that, like any good psychologist, I thought I should look for the bad trips. I wanted to find out what's not being talked about, what's the shadow side here. So this was part of the reason I interviewed 50 people in addition to the 81 who filled out the questionnaires. I was looking for some bad trips. So I would hear these terrible descriptions, and then the person would say, but I learned so much from it. So yes, it was a difficult, challenging, bad trip, and I wouldn't give it up. I wouldn't change it. If I could wave a magic wand, I wouldn't. I would keep my experience and what I learned from it. Now, that's kind of remarkable in itself. So I'm still searching for bad trips, but just to balance the intensity of the positive responses. Now, you know, I did this study, 5? No, I'm done. Let me talk about this a minute. I did this study out of my own relationship to grandmother ayahuasca, and I didn't question it terribly. However, 3/4 of the people who answered the question, do you have a personal relationship? When I got this 74%, I was blown away. For some reason, I couldn't believe it. This was most people having a personal relationship with ayahuasca. And I love the person who said, well, it comes up in the next slide, well, how is the relationship unfolding? 2 said in mystery. There's a lot of mystery here. And who is this spirit of ayahuasca? And the response one person gave was, I glow light. And I thought, you know, this is an intense personal experience, this relationship. What's it mean? And if a psychologist would answer this and say, well, this is your higher self. And I would really rather say, we don't know. So I asked 2 religion professors, and that was their answer. We don't know who this is. And so this is where discernment comes in, and I'm going to have to move through that quickly. But certainly you spoke about discernment a lot. I appreciate that. And this is a famous, it's an issue for discernment from Houston Smith. The goal cannot be stressed too often. It is not religious experiences, it's the religious life. What happens afterward? And so the bottom line, and I think this is what grandmother ayahuasca wanted out of this study, is that the 2 groups, the ayahuasca users and the people on the Catholic retreat, scored very similarly on the after the spiritual experience questionnaire, so that I could state, based on the statistics, that the ayahuasca users were participating in as sacred a ceremony as the people on the Catholic retreat, that this was a legitimate, authentic, spiritual process, and that that the sacred ceremonies are in keeping with the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. And this is what grants Native Americans the right to use peyote. And I think this is what grandmother ayahuasca wanted out of this study. And so that's what I found.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rachel. That was nice. Beautiful. Who has questions?
Thank you for your talk and for your study. It struck me when you were talking about the therapeutic effects of ayahuasca and people's reports that it was like having 10 years of psychotherapy in a night. I know I value how much it's enriched my own life, and I've seen people become sober and stay sober through ayahuasca. Yet at the same time, I've seen plenty of unintegrated and unresolved issues that people are, playing out in their lives and in their ayahuasca communities. So I guess I'm a little circumspect about how that it's still a question, like that people's self-reports sometimes need to be balanced in some ways by some type of more objective criteria. I'm thinking one time someone asked me when I came back from South America, was the experience transformative? Did it transform my life? And I told them that they'd be able to answer that better in a year rather than me making that claim. So
that's a good point.
Yeah.
That's a good point. I did have one of the questions was to be answered by somebody else other than the person filling out the questionnaire. And one mother answered the question for her 22-year-old son who was in his 5th year of college. And she said he's become more empathic and more communicative. So I thought that was a pretty good sign coming from a mother. But yes, that's a good way to ask it.
As somebody who's gone through a number of things, ceremonies and different transformational programs, and who works as a coach myself, I'm curious if you found that people taking on these ayahuasca ceremonies, this sort of just becomes the latest addiction, like an addiction to insight, like, wow, I've gotten these amazing insights, and then they'll do, 50 ceremonies in a row and still not change anything in their life. Do you find that there, while this is transformative, while you can get a lot of great insights, there is an absence of integration at times?
Well, this is really where the rubber meets the road, and I'm sure there are examples of that, as well as examples of people who changed their lives. And we don't know a lot about why do some people not change and why do others change. We don't know, but what we are seeing is that as a result of these intense spiritual experiences, people at least have an opportunity to change. This research is going to have to unfold, but it's a good question.
I was one of those 5 people who chose the do-it-yourself method, and my experience, I would argue, is definitely as sacred, religious, meaningful, and integrated as all of the other 80. I'm wondering, why don't you think that RFRA should apply to me too? My experience was religious. My experience was deeply important. My experience has been integrated. I'm alive and standing here today because of it. Why shouldn't the Religious Freedom Restoration Act apply to me too?
Well, you're asking it in a legal question, and it's going to be much harder for a legal way. I think traditionally this medicine has been used more as part of a communal experience, and I want to respect that tradition. And I'm glad you had a good experience. I think in terms of having it accepted legally by our culture, it's going to have to be, and as it has already been, in the context of a church. So there's going to need to be that social structure for it. But I'm glad you had a good experience.
As you were speaking, I was wishing that your comparison was not to a Catholic retreat, but to a retreat where the substance was the sacrament and there was sacrament, and let's say it was a ceremony around LSD or psilocybin, and what the differences, similarities would be there. And it seems to me there's such a lack of ceremony and lack of tradition. Grandmother ayahuasca, what do we refer to as LSD or mushrooms? And I'm just wondering your own, after all this work, your own perception of what would be the difference in your imagination, not a scientific study, but what would be the difference between?
I think there's a difference, and maybe Dennis will talk about this a little bit because he's the expert here on this. I think there's a difference when it's a plant substance and when it's in a chemical form. And I have no ability to talk about why, but Dennis does, and I hope he'll talk about this a little. This is you can see that you're talking about research that needs to happen in the next 20 years or so. It's a very good question. People are having these mystical experiences with different psychedelics, and the experiences sound similar, but how are the psychedelics different? What's different in the experience? And it's my belief, it's my intuitive hunch that there's a difference whether it's plant-based or out of a lab. But I'm going to ask Dennis to speak to that later.
I was wondering if in your research, in your study, you looked at all at what parts of these mystical experiences were informed or shaped by the the structure, the human, cultural and social structure around the experience, and if you looked for that, or if you plan to in the future.
I don't even know how to look for that. It's a great question. We know so little about what mystical experience is, what stimulates it. I mean, there are people who will take the same dose of depending on what the psychedelic is, and one will have a mystical experience and one won't. We know so little about this. It would be nice to know more.
I'm hoping you can talk a little bit more about the North American guides that are involved in these ceremonies, or maybe just about any trends you notice between your study participants' descriptions of set and setting and the meaning of the experience to them.
I think the most I can say is what I said, that they were done usually in a very ceremonial way, that they were done in a very sacred way. When I began this research, I actually expected less consistency. I expected there'd be a little wild use here and there, And I really didn't, I interviewed 81 people filled out the forms, and I interviewed another 50, and it just seemed across the board there was a real spiritual context for the use of the medicine. That's the most I can say. We don't really know what does it mean for a Westerner to be initiated, to have the right to lead a ceremony. We kind of don't know what that means. And there are no standards. And someone might say, well, I studied with a shaman in South America and we have no way of knowing what it means or how long they studied, or if that length of time even makes a difference. So it's really a buyer beware market. And now I'm going back to some of Yalila's presentation. This is a time to be very careful.
Rachel, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.